understand what Baltosif is my problem.
That's not the sukkah.
Yeah.
Not much I can say.
Probably a good company.
We began Chodesh Elul pointing out the significance and the connection between the mitzvah of Sukkah and the avodah of the Yemei Rachman B'Ratzain, that Gemara, as we mentioned then, understands that there's a concept of Agin Alayu Ki Sukkah. Sukkah represents the Hagana, it represents the Midas HaRachamim of the Rebbeinu Shalom. And now, as we reach the end of Chodesh Elul, we once again have the same illusion. Every day of the Yemei HaSlichos, we preface the first time we are invoking the Yud Gimel Midas HaRachamim, which the Levush explains as the Iker of the Avodah of Slichos. We say, B'tzel kenofecha nechse v'nisloinon keyoyim b'yered Hashem ba'onon. The idea of the Rebbeinu Shalom coming down in the Onon is symbolic of B'tzel kenofecha nechse v'nisloinon. What does it mean, B'tzel kenofecha nechse v'nisloinon? So Rabbi Yoina, in the beginning of Shari Tshuva, explains that B'tzel kenofecha nechse v'nisloinon is that a Baal Tshuva returns to once again become an Ohuv of the Rebbeinu Shalom and is then once again able to be B'tzel kenofecha nechse v'nisloinon, to be Korov to the Rebbeinu Shalom. V'yered Hashem ba'onon b'tzel knofecha nechse v'nisloinon are all remozim to Sukkah. So once again, we end the Chodesh of Tshuva, the end of Chodesh Rachim. This will be our last limud during Chodesh Elul. B'tzel knofecha nechse v'nisloinon. So let's again be ma'ayin be'ezer Hashem in a din and a prat in the mitzvah of YESHIVAS Sukkah. We'll begin once again with the lashon of the Rambam in Perek Vav Halacha Hev Hilchos Sukkah, page 42 in the Mara Mekaymis. Keitzad mitzvahs hayeshiva basukkah sheyeh oichel v'shoise v'dor basukkah kol shivas hayom. The Rambam includes in the requirements of mitzvahs yeshiva sukkah, the Rambam includes shoise, the din of shsiyah. The makar of the Rambam, as we'll go on to see, is the lashon of the Braisa in the Gemara and Daf Chav Ches, where the Gemara includes shsiyah as part of the Braisa of Keitzad mitzvahs yeshiva sukkah. The kasha that there is on this Rambam, that the Rambam includes shtia as part of the requirement of dira in the sukkah or yeshiva in the sukkah, is that in Halacha Vav, where the Rambam itemizes all the gedorim of achila and sheina and so on in the sukkah, and the Rambam again begins oichlin v'shoisim v'yeshenim basukkah kol shiva. The Rambam says, Umuter lishtois mayim, one can drink water, v'lechol peiros, and eat peiros chutz lasukkah. Umishe yachmir al atzmoi, v'lo yishte chutz lasukkah, afilu mayim, harezeh meshubach. Seemingly, the Rambam then has not included shtia in a chiyuv of being oichel teicha sukkah. The Rambam says if someone is machmir al atzmoi, v'lo yishte chutz lasukkah, afilu mayim, he's machmer that not just is he not shoise, but he's not shoise even mayim harezeh meshubach, implying that if a person is not machmir al atzmoi, then loy meboya he is going to drink mayim chutz lasukkah, but he bechlal will be shoise chutz lasukkah. In other words, shtia does not have the same din as achila, that a person can be shoiseh chutz lasukkah. And the Rambam doesn't give us any shear like he does by achila or by sheina, as it applies to the nefshtir. What shear would or would not be mechayiv sukkah? So l'chera we have a stira within the Rambam himself. That the Rambam begins by saying, Keitzad mitzvahs yeshivas HaSukkah she'oichel v'shoiseh v'dar b'sukkah kol shivas yamim. And the Rambam again in the beginning of Halacha Vav, oichlim v'shoisim v'yeshenim b'sukkah kol shivas. The Rambam again includes shtia. Then the Rambam goes on to give a shir for achila, osel echel chutz l'sukkah kol shiva, and achal achilas arai. And the Rambam gives the shir of achilas arai, which is a kibetza. Ve'en yeshenim chutz l'sukkah filu shenas arai. Masha'en ken for achilas peiros. The Rambam seems to say there's no shir, and that's mutar chutz l'sukkah, and so too shtia. And therefore the Rambam concludes, umi sheyachmer asatzmoi v'lo yishteh chutz l'sukkah afilu mayim harei mishuch. So we have a stira minei bay. Is shtia a maisa which has to take place in the sukkah, or is it not? If it's a maisa that doesn't have to take place in the sukkah, then why does the Rambam say twice, Keitzad mitzvahs yeshiva b'sukkah she'oichel b'shoiseh b'dar oichlim v'shoisim v'yeshenim b'sukkah kol shiva. So as we'll see, the Hemshech, we were zeiche to have now printed from Ksav Yad the Pirush of Rabbeinu Monoach on the Rambam, the Beis Menucha, and Rabbeinu Monoach himself asks the Shaila. But Rabbi Seinu Achronim didn't have that to Rabbeinu Monoach, and the Shaila is asked by the Bir Halacha. The context in which the Bir Halacha asks the Shaila is not directly related to the Rambam, but the Bir Halacha is explaining a machlokes harishonim as to whether yayin, wine, must be drunk inside the sukkah or could be drunk outside the sukkah. In the pages of the Mishnah Berurah, Siman Tov Reish Lamed Tes Seif Beis, that's just after the Aruch HaShulchan, Tov Reish Tes Lamed Beis Seif Beis is page 83 in the Mishnah Berurah's pages. The Mechaber says, "Aval muter lechol achilas harai chutz l'sukkah." One can eat an achilas harai outside the sukkah. The very last line of the Mechaber, top of page 83. V'kama achilas harai kabetza mipas, like the Rambam said. Umuter lishtois mayim, and one can drink mayim, v'yayin and wine, v'lechol peiros chutz l'sukkah. And then the Mechaber says, "Umi sheyachmer al atzmoi v'leyishteh chutz l'sukkah afilu mayim." So if we note carefully, the Mechaber has added one word to the Rambam which we don't have. The Mechaber added the word yayin. If we look back on page 42 in the end of Halacha Vav, the Rambam says, "Umuter lishtois mayim v'lechol peiros chutz l'sukkah." The Mechaber added v'yayin. It includes the din of yayin. Now, what's the chiddush that necessitated the Mechaber to add that even yayin can be nechal, can be drunk chutz l'sukkah? As the Mishnah Berurah explains, if we look in Sifkotin Yud Gimel, so that's the right-hand side on page 83, about halfway down Sifkotin Yud Gimel, where the line begins v'da and then a comma. Says the Mishnah Berurah, v'da. Another achroinim hesitate with this halacha. There is a concept which we know in the halachas of Birchas Hanenin that one can be koveya to be shoise yayin. Like one can be koveya to be oichel pas, one can be koveya to be shoise yayin. Those achroinim then say that im shoise yayin bekvius chayav b'sukkah ubefrat b'nei chabura, a group of people, shekovu lishtois yayin, who join together to drink wine together, bevadai have a keva gomer. That would be considered keva. And therefore, they qualify the Mechaber, that the Mechaber that says yayin can be consumed chutz l'sukkah. They say in a circumstance where the yayin is being drunk in the form of kvius, in this context of a kvius, it's awesome. The Mishnah Berurah paskins halacha le'inin bracha hiskimu kamachreim de'ein levarech leisha basukkah. One should not make the bracha of leisha basukkah in that case. So the Mishnah Berurah brings that there is a machloikes. If we should lechatchila be soymech on the mechaber to drink yain chutz sukkah, or if yain is drunk in the form of kviyos, should it be not done outside the sukkah? The Bir Halacha, opposite column, Dibur Maskal v'yayin. So the Bir Halacha says that he will now explain the reasoning behind each shita. Now, we won't elaborate extensively on the shita of the mechaber because it's not directly relevant to our limud. We'll just briefly mention the shita of the mechaber. So the Mishnah Berurah points out, and he says, the Bir Halacha points out, and he says, the afilu kova alayu, the mechaber that allowed the consumption of yayin chutz lasukkah is even referring to a case where the yayin is being consumed in the context of a kviyus. And he says, kein muchach b'Beis Yosef v'darchei Moshe. V'hine hagro mevi makar l'dasa shulchan aruch. From the Gemara in Brachas, Damirun shom behedyad le'inyan birchas hamazon d'lei kovi inish sudosa layayin. If yayin can accomplish the same kviyos as su'uda, in other words, and therefore we will be obligated to make a full birchas hamazon on yayin, the Gemara says there's no such thing. However much one is kivei asuda ala yayin, it will never achieve the same status of kviyos as kviyos ala pas. And therefore, says the Gra, the mechaber therefore assumed that it's only the kviyos that is mechayiv, birchas hamazon or something similar to that kviyos that will be mechayiv yeshivas sukkah. But since yayin, even if one is kivei, is batla daita etzel koladam, it's a unique darga of kviyos for yayin, but will never achieve the same kviyos of suda, memele hu adin in sukkah. That's the basic concept that the Gra says underlies the opinion of the mechaber, that yayin, even in a case of kova, can never achieve the same status of kviyos as kviyos ala pas, and therefore there's no makom to be machmir, even in the case of kviyos, to be mechayiv sukkah. This is the shita of the shita of the mechaber. Now, if we go down a number of lines, about 10 lines, in the middle of the line, the Bir Halacha begins a sentence, "Va'atam neva'er das hacholkim." It's about 7 lines on the bottom of the column of the Bir Halacha. In the middle of the column, "Va'atam neva'er das hacholkim." So the Mishnah Berurah says that the cholkim debate whether or not the sugya in brachas of kviyos ala yayin that doesn't have the same status of kviyos ala pas, is that analogous to the dinim of sukkah, or the dinim of sukkah don't require the same status of kviyos as birchas hamazon? But then the Bir Halacha says the following. He says he will bring his own raya to counter the shita of the mechaber. Dahainu, the Bir Halacha is now going to bring a raya that the yayin is mechayev sukkah. Zot the Bir Halacha, mikol mokum merely sad godol l'shitosam. A sad godol, says the Mishnah Berurah, says the Bir Halacha. Where? From the Mefurish Gemara. Says why? Tonu Rabbanon, there's a brayse, Teishvu ke'ein taduru. What does Teishvu ke'ein taduru obligate? Oichel v'shoise basukah. This loshon of the Rambam, that dira basukah requires shtia, as we mentioned in the introduction, actually comes from a brayse and Daf Ches. V'chein Pirush Rashi, Perish HaYoshin Rashi, in the beginning of the second parak of Sukkah says, the Ikke Yeshiva Hasivas HaSukkah Achila V'Shtia V'Sheina. And Rashi includes Shtia in the list. Frek the Bir Halacha. Ubesugyan Mashma, in the Gemara itself it implies, the Mada Omer Rabbi Gamliel in Dlisha Shalmayim, that they wanted to bring to Rabbi Gamliel a bucket of water to drink from. Duhu Chumra Ba'alma, that it was only a chumrah that Rabbi Gamliel didn't want to drink that mayim outside the sukkah, which is the makor of the Rambam, and the Bach says this mefurish in Siman Tov Reish Chavtes, that the Rambam says, the makor is to be machmer like Rabbi Gamliel. Zok the Bir Halacha v'al korchoch shomayri l'ninyayin d'chashive. So when the Brisa says that dira basukah obligates shtia in the sukkah, what are we talking about? And when Rashi says that the ikadira is achila and shtia and sheina, what shtia are we talking about? HaRav Gamliel drinking toicha sukkah, Zot the Gemara was a chumrah. So what shtia are we talking about? Zok the Bir Halacha al Kochach, we must be talking about Yayin. That's the resolution to the stira. We began by asking that on the one hand, the Rambam begins by saying, like the Brisa says in Daf Chof Ches, Keitzadi mitzvah yeshiva basukkah, page 42 in the pages of the Mara Mekaymes, Keitzadi mitzvah yeshiva basukkah, she oichel v'shoiseh the dar basukkah. And so to the beginning of Halacha Vav, oichlim v'shoisim v'yeshenim basukkah. It's almost word for word the lashon of Rashi in the beginning of Hayoshin. But yet the Rambam says, meaning mayim and other things. So what's the shtia that sukkah is mechayev? Zot the Bir Halacha al Kochach, the shtia that sukkah is mechayev is the shtia of yayin. What's the reason why yayin is mechayev? Not because even necessarily we're referring to yayin where it is consumed in the form of a kviyos, but yayin itself because of the chashivus of yayin. Yain is something which is ishtani liluya. Yain is something which is choshev v'koshel bracha. Yain is something which, different to all mashkin, is not considered zeya ba'alma. It's not considered just an extract. It's considered the gufa pri. It's something on which there's kviyos. Therefore, says the Bir Halacha, yain de chashivi is considered mechayiv sukkah. Therefore, says the Bir Halacha, the basis of the machloikes between the mechaber and the cholkim, if yayin is mechayiv sukkah, is if the chashivus of the shtia of yayin mechayiv sukkah. So we have now three shitas. The mechaber holds that even in a case of kviyus, we need the equivalent of the kviyus of pas, that's mechayiv birchas hamazon. And pas abba b'kisnin, perhaps we'll discuss in a further limud b'lineda. Then we have the shita of the cholkim, the bach, and that the Sharatzion references, that hold that yayin where one is kriveya, and befrat in the case of chaverim not kriveya, has to have sukkah. Then we have the shita of the cholkim, which in a moment the Bir Halacha is going to go on to say is the shita of the Rambam, and we saw so far it's the shita of Rashi, and says the Bir Halacha that's the pashtus of the Brisa and Daf Chof Ches, that yayin, because it's choshuv, even if consumed not in the context of a kviyus, is still mechayev sukkah. Let's just continue a little further in the Bir Halacha. V'chein muchach midas Rambam. The Bir Halacha now makes a diuk nifla in the Rambam himself. V'chein muchach midas Rambam shelo yehetik elo demuter lishtais mayim chutz lasukkah v'lo yizkir yayin klal. Let's go back to the lashon of the Rambam on page 42 of the Mara Mekaymes. The Rambam said, mitzvah yeshiva basukkah includes shtia, beginning of halacha hey. Beginning of halacha vav, oichlin v'yeshenim v'sukkah called oichlin v'shoisim v'yeshenim basukkah. Then the Rambam says, umuter, what are you allowed to do? Umuter lishtois mayim b'lechol peiros chutz lasukkah. So, says the Bir Halacha, why only muter lecha lishtois mayim? Why shouldn't the Rambam say it's muter lishtois even yayin chutz lasukkah? So we were medayik from the end of the Rambam, where the Rambam says, "Umisher acher alatzim ebelishte chutz lasukkah afilu mayim harezem meshubach," implying that other mashkim may also be consumed chutz lasukkah. But says the Bir Halacha, we have to be miyashav the steer in the Rambam in Eyubei. On the one hand, the Rambam says, "What's muter to be sheisa chutz lasukkah mayim." On the other hand, the Rambam says, how are we miyashav the two? The answer is, yayin is an exception. Mayim means mayim and all mashkim. The exception would be yayin. That mipnei its chashivus, yayin is also. Let's see the last words of the Bir Halacha. V'al korchoch shomai linyan chashivus, v'chein muchach midas Rambam. Shelo yehetik elo demuter lishleis mayim chutz lasukkah v'lo yizkir klal. Turn the page. From page 84, Ba'al Korchach, left-hand side, Ba'al Korchach in yayin chayiv basukkah. Now here the Bir Halacha goes on to qualify, and he goes on to say like this. So far we've established, and the Bir Halacha says it's a sad godah, that there must be a case of a shtia, which is also chutz lasukkah. And the only option the Bir Halacha sees, and we're going to see Be'ez Hashem in Sharatzion, that there's another option, which will be the yishuv to the cholkim on this, and on the Rambam, namely the Shulchan Aruch, who allows shtias yayin even by kviyos. But the only option to be miyashav how the brisa can say shtia has to be basukah. How Rashi could say that the ikar of dira is oichlin b'shoisim v'yeshenim. How the Rambam can say twice that achila and shtia and shena has to be basukah is to say yain. However, the Biur Halacha says we still have the following question. We said that there are three different applications of the din of yain. One is any yain for its chashivos, yain only in the oifen of kviyos, or yain even in the oifen of kviyos. The mechaber was matter even yain in the oifen of kviyos. The cholkim that the Sharat Tzimim brings say yain, but not in the oifen of kviyos. And the Rambam, Kipshutai, and Rashi, and the Lashon Brisa seems to say all yain. So the Biur Halacha, no. We only have a right to say that the Rambam was machmir, not to be shoyse yain chutz HaSukkah in the case of a kviyos. El the tzorach loyma, the kimoyle Indian pass leichibe elav akilas kva, kein beyayin kai gavno, v'zeh the isa b'mishnah oichlin v'shoysim arai chutz HaSukkah michlal d'shtias keva oser v'hainu beyayin d'mayim lechashivi klal. So says the Biur Halacha, and that's going to be the issue for the Rambam. There is a case where even yayin can be drunk chutz HaSukkah, and therefore the machmir is even on yayin, and there's a case where yayin can't. What's the difference? Kviyos. So the maskon of the Biur Halacha is that if you want to be machmir, not like the mechaber, the most we can say is that we should be machmir b'makom kviyos. We don't have a right to say more than that in Shittas Rambam or in Rashi or in the Pashtus of the Brisa. So the maskon of the shaila that we began with is the Biur Halacha. And the MS, like we said, the Biur Halacha didn't have this, but we are zoicha to Rabbeinu Monoach. And Rabbeinu Monoach and the Rambam asks this kasha. Top of the right on the supplementary man in the Kaimus, we have copied Rabbeinu Monoach.
Let's make this bigger if we can on the screen.
Late Rishonim. And there's Mefarish on the Rambam. The original manuscript is called Beis Menucha and was published as a separate work and then was supplemented by further Ksavyan and then published in the Franco Rambam. So Zok Rabbeinu Monoach, he says, if we go down to the fourth line, middle of the line, by the period, what about drinking wine without eating? Says Rabbeinu Monoach, Yesh Misha Oimer Kiven de Yayin Choviv, because yayin is something choviv. V'goyrim brocha la'atzmoi. So choviv, goyrim brocha la'atzmoi, u'bekol mokim nikreis asud al shem hayayin, k'dichsiv vayas avrom mishte godol. Ein she'ein asud on nikreis el al shem hayayin. So again, Masechta Megillah. So because of the chashivos of these three properties of yayin, therefore it should be mechayiv shtia basukah. Uboy sukkah. Zok the Rabbeinu Monoach, and this is the Metzia and Rabbeinu Monoach. V'zeu she'omru chachomim oichel v'shoise basukah u'kemoshe kosav HaRav, like the Rambam says, she'oichel v'shoise v'dor basukah. So the Toich Dvar of Rabbeinu Monoach has both brought the raya from the Brisa and resolved the steer in the Rambam Minei Ubei. Kedarkom shel Rishonim b'Ketzar Mamash. So we see in Rabbeinu Monoach this shaila. How do we explain the Rambam and how do we explain the Brisa? Zok Rabbeinu Monoach, we're speaking about Rambam, we're speaking about yain. V'hamachmir tovay olav bracha, aval einay mevarach leisha basukah. He says that mikamokon peri ninhu uperi ptirim in asukah. Now this is a dover nifla in Rabbeinu Monoach, which requires a limud by itself. What this pshara is that on the one hand, Shoyse yain should be shoyse teich HaSukkah, but yet it won't have bracha. We'll get back to that later. Perhaps not in this limud, perhaps in a further limud. But the point of Rabbeinu Monoach is two things. Firstly, that the very raya and the yishuv to the Rambam of the Biur Halacha is mefurish in Rabbeinu Monoach. But there's another point. Rabbeinu Monoach is mevur that the Rambam will be mechayiv shtia teich HaSukkah even without kriyos. Why? Because his reasons are choviv. The second reason is chilik bracha la'atzmoi, and the third is because Hashem asud on nikra yayin. Chaviv l'chayr seems to be chashivos. Where exactly the lashon of chaviv b'yayin needs still even what Rabbeinu Monoach specifically is referring to. But the chashivos of the yayin is minei ubei. It's like the Biur Halacha began with chashivi. So therefore, Yishuv to the Rambam in Eyubei is that we're talking about Yain and Mepnei Chashivos, it's Mechayev Sukkah. Now, L'chayra, the Bir Halacha has said that this is a sad godol to the Cholkim, a Lashon HaBraisa, Rashi, and a Rambam. So the Rambam and Rashi are Rishonim, and the Beis Yosef and the Darchei Moshe base their kula to be Shoyse Yain Chutz LaSukkah, which is the Shita of Mechaber, on other Rishonim. Uri is down in the Shaila, we see Rabbeinu Monoach being such a Yeshonim. But how we miyashav the Braisa? What's the case of Oichlin B'Shoysim, Toich HaSukkah? What's the Braisa talking about? The Saad Godel from Rashi is Rashi. The Raya from the Rambam is the Rambam, but it's a Braisa. Let's go back to the Lashon of the Bi Halacha for a moment, on page 83. He said, Mikol Mokum really Sad Godel, 6 lines from the bottom. Sad Godel Lishitosem or the Isa Bagimara, Tonu Rabbon Teshu came to do Oicha B'Shoysa B'Sukkah. What's that shtia referring to? So here we can reference a Sharat Zion, a Dover Nifla that's Mavur in the Sharat Zion. On this page, if we look in the Mishnah Berurah, the same Mishnah Berurah that we looked at before, Sifkot in Yud Gimel, and we look at the beginning of the Mishnah Berurah. The Mishnah Berurah says, Vihine, 4th line at the end of the line. Mashihigir Ramova afilu kova alayu. That the Ramah says that even if you're kiveh, one can eat peiros chutz LaSukkah. Says the Mishnah Berurah ko igam al yayin, that refers even to yayin, as we saw in the Bir Halacha. Namely, the sheet of the mechaber is that even yayin in the form of kvius doesn't require a sukkah. What's the reason? The yayin ein nechshav rak achilas peri v'kol shekein shar mashkim, because yayin is only considered like the achila of shar peri and certainly any other mashkim. V'al kein loy choshev kvius didu. Like there is no keva leperis, the Gemara says in Brachos. There's no keva leperis. So too, the in YESHIVAS SUKKAH, there's no keva legabe yayin. As I state in Mishnah Berurah. Now let's look at this Sharat Zion in Sukkot and Chof Tes, just below. Zot the Bir Halacha, Zot the Sharat Mishnah Berurah. Where's my card to say as a psak that if it will be soymech on the mechaber of the Ramah, one can be shoyse even yayin chutz HaSukkah b'kviyos. Chen mashma b'bir agra. Now he says, "V'ho the isa b'gemara oichlin b'shoysim b'sukkah." The kasha the Bir Halacha. What shtia are we referring to? So we'll say perhaps yayin doesn't need, but we certainly need one case that will be mechayev sukkah, and the only case is yayin b'kviyos. We can debate any yayin, but we have to have some case that's mechayev sukkah b'shtia. It must be yayin b'kviyos. V'hu tak loshen zeh b'reish ha'seif. And if you'll somehow say zot the Sharat Zion, that maybe that loshen ha'braisa is shoni b'machloikes. Maybe it's only according to one Tana. Zot the Sharat Zion, the mechaber brings that loshen. Iker mitzvah YESHIVAS SUKKAH on the facing page 82. Iker ketzah mitzvah YESHIVAS SUKKAH shei oichel b'shoyse. Mefurish shei oichel b'shoyse. Lashon of the Rambam, which is a mechaber copy. So what's the case of shtia? Zot the Bir Halacha, zot the Sharat Zion, and from here comes a chidush which has broad ramifications of halacha. Zot the Sharat Zion. Hainu la'achar achilosei besuda shederech lishtoisei az tzorich lishtois gamken besuda d'nichlal hu basuda. We're speaking about the case where he's being shoyse, after the suda, that the usual way was to end the suda with shtias yain, like his mavura in the Gemara in the end of Ketzah Mevarchim. Shetzorich lishtois gamken basuda. Why? D'nichlal hu basuda. Aval shtia bli achila lechashiva lechayva b'sukkah. The teishu came to do a rachmana ve'in shtia bli achila. Normally shtia yain accompanies achila. So zok the Sharat Zion is another yishuv for the Gemara. We asked, what's the case of shtia that has to be teicha sukkah? Zok the Sharat Zion, it means a shtia that's in part of a suda. And the mele zok the Sharat Zion, when it's part of the suda, nichlal hu basuda. And therefore it has the status of kviyos, not of the kviyos of yayin, but of the kviyos of a suda. If it has the status of the kviyos of the suda, then the mele it's mechayiv sukkah. Firto is the Sharat Zion, and this has broad, like we said, ramifications of halacha. The efshad lefizeh afmayim b'soich hasuda ein kedai lishto is chutz sukkah v'tzorich iyun. A chiddush nifla lahalacha, and Rabbi said this has very, very broad ramifications. What the Sharat Zion is saying is, if yayin can have the chashivos of kviyos by virtue of the fact that it's integral to the suda, then says the Sharat Zion, that might not be something specific to yayin, that there is a format of a suda, that the suda concludes with a shia of yayin. Anything that is tofel to the suda also has the status of a kviyos of suda. Correct. And now, Paris will qualify, but let's say, for example, a very motzidiki case. One washes and made the YESHIVAS sukkah, and you go inside and you want to take a part of the main course before it gets brought out.
Chapa piece.
But for the Sharat Zion, there's a serious shaila if one can do that. Because since that's included in the kiyas of the Suda, even though ein keval Paris and even Basar and Gvina is only in an oifen of kol halayu, but that's all because it's not nichal in the kiyas of the Suda. But if it's nichal in the kiyas of the Suda, it can't be done. Now, let's introduce before this nafkamina a different nafkamina, in a way a more straightforward nafkamina, which the Sharat Zion doesn't refer to directly. We know that what's mechayev, the achila of pas, is a kibeya. What would be if a person would be kiveya to be oichel pas in the sukkah? And he ate a kibeya of pas. Now he wants to go out to the sukkah and he wants to eat less than the shir kviyus. He wants to eat kazayas pas, or Shabbos and Yontif kazayas pas is a shayla. Maybe Shabbos and Yontif is kiveya, less than the kazayas pas. Sees a little morsel of challah on the counter and wants to pick it up and eat it outside the sukkah. Can one do that? Less than the kibeya is not mechayev sukkah. So it would seem from the Sharat Zion that avada that would remain a chilek of the suda. Why? Because only in Mayin does the Sharat Zion have a suffix. And Yayin is the chiddush of the Sharat Zion. But certainly Pas, which is the Ikra Suda, very possible that one can't. So let's see in the supplementary Maramakomis, there's copied a piece of Rabbi Yosef Shaul Natanzon in Shuvas Shoel Meishiv, where Rabbi Yosef Shaul suggests a chiddush. And Kanira, Rabbi Yosef Shaul didn't find the Kli Makar in the posting for the Shaila, and the Chor Lefid Vorenu, there should be Mavur from the Sharat Zion, which obviously is obviously later, but he says that the Rabbi Yosef Shaul says the following: Ko'es nira dover chodosh. I want to be mechadash a chiddush. Dihine lefinu istaiti hoyanir the after coming of the oichle machila sarai chutz la sukkah. That you're allowed to eat an achila sarai chutz la sukkah. Hainu, that's in the case. Dim eine roitza leleches la sukkah ba'oichle chutz la sukkah aminon the eine mechuyev lechol ba'sukkah. Aval in kva yoshev ba'sukkah, he's already in the sukkah. Ve'ochal dover shechayev lechol ba'sukkah shuv eine rashai lo niach ha'sukkah v'lechol chutz la sukkah af shir achila sarai. As this is what Rabbi Yosef Shaul says, the dover chodosh that you didn't see in the poskim. V'tam hadover, what's the reason? Nirlani is daiti kiven de kvar nikva olav chiyuv asukah nischayev afal shir arai. Once his achila is an achila of kvar, that's mechayev sukkah, any other achila that's done as part of that seder achila is also mechayev. And therefore nothing that's considered arai, that's part of the context of that achila, could be nechal chutz sukkah. As they state in the Beis Shol. Which means anything that's arai, which means mayim is always called arai, Paris is always called arai. As once I was kriveya for achila, and this is in somehow related to that achila, it can't be done chutz sukkah. As is up there. If you want to see Rabbi Yosef Shaul's Ge'inish Mashal, he brings such an amazing dogma to this. Something completely unrelated. If you want a quiz question to your shaila, how dini mominus has an afkimina in Hilchas YESHIVAS sukkah. So we'll see Rabbi Yosef Shaul's tushtal. He says, "Ukein ze omer b'mitzia dafn involved." The aim based in is kokim al pachas mishav pruta. There's no yeshivas bezdin if the monetary claim is less than a pruta. Aval im hoyu betchila say pruta kiven the kvar nizkiku le pruta nischayvu af pachas mishav pruta. Once the case begins about the shav pruta, then the case can continue to judge even if it's pachas mishav pruta. V'hu adin kan kol shekvar yoshev b'sukkah v'kol b'sudosa shuv afarai nasa keva. That's the chiddush of Rabbi Yosef Shol. Now, the Bir Halacha, the Sharat Tziyun, is discussing things which are integral to the Suda. Seemingly, the Rabbi Yosef Shol is saying that any achilas arai that's related to the Suda somehow would be included in the Suda. What would the nafkamina be? The nafkamina would be, and I found the Shara Be'ez Hashem that Rabbi Nissen Karelitz discusses, what would be in the case where I'm being oichel something in the middle of the Suda chutz la sukkah, but it has the din of dvorim haboim b'soich hasuda shaloi machmas hasuda, that in that case it requires its own bracha. Let's say, for example, an apple pie is served in the middle of the Suda. It's possible that today the Matthias has changed and apple pie has become part of a regular main course menu, but Shiloh question, or if we want to take a Shiloh that the Mishabur discusses, or the Minhag Olam, it's not like this. Eating pickles in the middle of the Suda, the Mishabur discusses, is that considered an integral part of the Suda, although the Minhag Olam today is to consider an integral part of the Suda, not make a bracha. But all these examples of Dvarim Haboim B'Seich HaSuda, Shaloi Machmas HaSuda, that's Mechayev bracha. In that case, says in Nissen Karelitz, perhaps even the Sharat Tziyun would agree that you could eat chutz sukkah. Why? Because the Sharat Tziyun is only saying it by yayin because that's a derech to finish the Suda that way, and by mayin because it's integral to the Suda, it doesn't have a bracha lefanov. Or any other achila that's part and included in the ikar bracha of the Suda. But maybe something that's mechayev bracha b'fnei atzmoi, actually is static. So Nissen Karelitz claims. But according to the Rabbi Yosef Shol, any achila sarai, as long as it's part of the Suda menu, once you are koivei lechol chutz l'sukkah, b'toich hasukkah, achila sarai is now disallowed. This is the chiddush that emerges from Rabbi Yosef Shol Natanzon and the Sharat Tziyun. Hanogeh to our sugya, that this now is the resolution to a case of shtir. We now have three ways to explain what the Bryce is referring to when it says that you have to be sheisa teich hasukkah. One is yayin in the case of kval. Two is yayin b'soich hasuda. Three is mayin if it's teich hasuda. Because mayin teich hasuda also has the status of kval. Like we say, this creates a very broad nafkamina, and it's very matziv the shayla. It's going out to the kitchen in the middle of the Suda to take an achila sarai in the kitchen, to drink a cup of water outside the sukkah, in the middle of the Suda.
Somebody eats cake in the sukkah. Somebody eats cake. Somebody eats cake in the sukkah. Right? We have to eat cake in the sukkah.
Yes.
Kind of this. So if he takes another small piece of cake outside, is that shy for this? Or will that assume?
So he was kaveh al pasav al which is a shadow.
Yeah, more than a kaveh.
Okay, al pasav al which is a shadow, right? Which is a shadow that's a kviyos. Yes.
But let's say he eats it off.
Yes.
It's kaveh for break.
Yes.
Now he goes takes another small piece of cake outside the sukkah.
He wouldn't be allowed to. Correct. He would not be allowed to. Correct. Exactly. Correct. And we see that this nidin, this shaila, which is such a basic shaila, Rabbi Yosef Shol doesn't have a clear ma'akim for it. We have a Sharat Tziyun, and the Sharat Tziyun says that Shtias Yayin, that's part of the Seder Suda not, and Melu Hu Adin Mayin, that's drunk Teich Suda. But from the Sharat Tziyun, it would seem to come out that we should be choishish that any achilo of something that's not the Chayiv Bracha Lefanov, which is what Nissen Karelitz points out, avada should not be done Teich Suda outside the Sukkah. So this is the first step of today's limud, to just explain the three possible mahalchim of explaining what the Rambam is referring to when he speaks about that shtia has to take place teich hasukkah, which the Bialacha points out is a braysa, and this is the nidin of the Sharat Tziyun. Now let's continue on to the chumrah of the Rambam that is brought in Shulchan Aruch. If we go back to the Lashon Rambam on page 42, the Rambam said, "U'mishe yachmer al atzmoi," in the end of Halacha Vav, "U'mishe yachmer al atzmoi v'lo yishlech chutz lasukkah afilu mayim harei zeh meshubach." Mishe machmer al atzmoi ve'eino shoyse. What is the reason for this chumrah? So the Bialacha pointed out, this comes from the Gemara, that Rabbi Gamliel was machmer, and he said when they brought him the dli shel mayim, they brought him the water, he said, "Halei basukah." He was machmer. What's the reason for the chumrah? What's the basis of that chumrah? Often many of the kadmonim on this habit that in Sukkah we have kolapotim midover voiseun ikrahedjet. So what's the concept of being machmer al atzmo? Or to we're coming to be moisef al mitzvah Sukkah. Potter is potter. What's the hisab? We can answer the further shot. The Rambam brings the chumrah of misha yachim atzmo elishte hafilu chutz Sukkah hafilu mayim only in the context of shtia. What about being machmer al atzmoi to be yoshev the sukkah, never to leave it? Or what about being machmer al atzmoi to always be matayel in the sukkah, or to always be medaber in the sukkah? Once we seemingly have a gemara of Rabbi Gamliel machmer al atzmoi, which Rambam is paskening, that even though shtias nayim shaloi b'suda is not mechayiv sukkah, but there's a machmer al atzmoi. So why can't that apply to all aspects of yeshiva? What's special and unique for negeh to shtias mayim that shtias mayim has a yachmer al atzmoi? What's the chiluk? It's kedai to point out, and this is not in the Maramakom, it's just kedai to point out briefly, a chidush nifla that's mevur in the Sefer Yesod b'Sheresh HaAvodah. The Sefer Yesod HaAvodah says that the lashon of the brisa is that even tiyul has to take place in the sukkah. It's a lashon of the mechaber. If you go back to the Shulchan Aruch on page 82, Ketzad mitzvos hayeshiva basukkah shia oichel b'shoiser b'yoshin u'metayel. The Ramah augments the mechaber by including yoshin u'metayel v'dar basukkah. So the Yeshiva Shalom said, what does metayel mean? So he says what that means is, afilu yeshiva ayalicha ma'at tzorich dafka basukkah. Lefize, says the Yesod Sheresh Havodah, mechuyev ha'odom li zoher sheloi yetze kol shivas yimei hachag me'asukkah lebeisoi klal imloi ledover hechreichi ma'oid, unless it's essential. Ulahamshel hadover azeh, for example, in tzorich l'shtia umuchrach lotzes masukkah labayis loymar lehovi loy mashke lasukkah. And he says, Osoloi lishes bebeso, you shouldn't tarry in the house. Rak shir hadiburim shal tzorchei ashtia, just long enough to arrange that you should get the drink. V'ike chaloise ledaber miyad chayev loshu basukkah. Ki im yishem ma'at yoisem ikdei tzorka babayis oiver al mitzvahs esei shal basukkahs teishvu. You've been mevatel mitzvah. K'fi shemavur b'loshen avudron. Al rega v'rega sheshor b'beisi chutz lasukkah al loy dover achreichi oiver al mitzvahs esei menapeh. Says, what's my raya? Because when it comes to limud HaTorah, we learn to halacha in the very first limud that it says you should be loymed b'sukkah b'ma'ayin, you can be ma'ayin chutz ha'sukkah because of harchavas hadas. Why should one have to be loymed b'sukkah? What's that? Elamai, every moment one needs to be in the sukkah. Now, the Achronim point out that avada that you see the Sheresh Havodah says that it's a bittul of a mitzvah essay, and that korega v'rega the yishoy chutz ha'sukkah over al mitzvah essay in HaTorah. That they say that you say the Sheresh Havodah said al derech hachasidus, but and derech hazihirus yisera. But the point of the Sheresh Havodah is well taken. The Maaseh, with every additional moment of yeshiva in the sukkah, whether it's yeshiva or tiyul or limud, one's mekayim, but it's a sukkah stage. So why do we find lahachmir al atzmoi dafka in the case of shia, but not in the case of all yeshiva? Person wants to sit outside in the fresh air. Right? So unless he has a clear svara that it's marcheves daitoi, avadu the derech of the odom is to be yoshev sometimes chutz lebeisoi. We sit on our porch, but so too is the derech to be sheisar rai chutz lebeisoi. So the same way as there's a yachmer al atzmoi to be sheisar basukkah, so let there be a yachmer al atzmoi to be yoshev to chasukkah. And the Yisrael Shabbat says, "Anachadami one should." So how would we yashav the levais and the mishenim? It's not muslim. So we find it over mechudesh l'chayra in the Tshuvas of Rabbi Yosef Shalom Matanzon, where the Shalom Meshiv on the supplementary Maramakomis on the right-hand side, just below the first paragraph of Shalom Meshiv that we saw before, the Shalom Meshiv says a svara. He says the reason is because, and like the Lashon Rambam implies, it's a chumrah. Why is that chumrah that made? Shema, he'll come to be oichel or shoyse kva chutz ha'sukkah. It's a harchaka. It's a gzeir. Roy lahachmir. says, "V'hine b'hada amru b'sukkah daf chavav ma'aseh v'yivir l'rechman zakit tapshel litoim u'ler gamliel shtei kaisavais v'dlishal mayim v'amru halam l'sukkah u'ma'aseh v'yivir l'rtzodek oicha pachas mikabetza not lebamaka b'karcha v'otzah chutz l'sukkah v'kosav HaRav and the Ran writes the kaimelon dim talmud chacham roitz l'achna atzmoi rashai v'im roitz l'achna atzmoi gam ken rashai u'lefiani is daiti near dini be'emes yesh l'hachmer b'sukkah af ba'achilas harai Kimoit imas atabshel v'koisvais. That's in the shir of the Kebeah. The heim peri. Ubeprater megamliel the svile de mavarach birchas hamazon al shiva minin. He holds his kvios. V'roi lahachmer why gezeira shema yoichal kva. Zot the base show. The reason is because we choishesh that you'll be oichal kva. The chashach of achilas kva. So according to Yosef Shol, we now have a yishuv nifla to this basic kasha that we asked. We asked, firstly, where does that chumrah come from? What's the siba for that chumrah? Otu, we're some coming to be potter b'dover by seyu. We're coming to be moisav ha-mitzvah sukkah. And why, therefore, do we not find that chaymer never to be yoshev chutz ha-sukkah, even without achila b'shti or shem? The answer is, the Yosef Shol, it's a HaRav from achilas kva. That's the first mahalach that we have b'shitz. And therefore, that's miyashiv, that it's only negea in the context of achila and shtia. The ha'ara on this Yosef Shol is that if we look, I'm just wondering if we have the time to just expand on this nicely. Where is the time, Rabbi say? Oh, HSukkah. So the Shari Tshuva brings a discussion. If this chumrah of not being shoysem mayim chutz l'sukkah, how extensive is that? Does that mean that therefore an achilas harai of less than a kibetza, one should also be machmir to be oichel techasukah, or only a shtia of a full shear of sheer shtia? So the Shari Tshuva brings a machlokes about this. If you want to see it briefly, it's on page 84 of the Mishnah Berurah's pages. In the Shari Tshuva, in the wide lines, 5 lines from the end of the Shari Tshuva, there's a parenthesis with there's an asterisk within square brackets. It says, I am Babir Yosef, Shekosav Hashem Tzedal Aderech Shechumra Yisera, V'kosav Rabbeinu Yerucham, the Pachis Mikabetza Ein Mishayachner. Ube'el Yerabah Hikshal Zeh. Babir Yosef Kosav Liyashik Tzatz. So we have like this, that the Chumra of being Shoyse, HaSukkah means you're being Shoyse a full shear, and even though it's Mayim and not Yaim, still should be Shoyse Chutzah. But an Achila Pachis Mikashir, there's no chumrah. Now the ha'ara, according to Yosef Shol Nachman's on, is the chayr. If the reason of the chumrah is a HaRav, so the chayr we should still have the HaRav. Then maybe he'll be oichel l'shir. Why do we find that the Rishonim say that the HaRav is only when one is oichel only when one's oichel l'shir, when no one's oichel pachas mikashir. The chayr the HaRav maybe you'll be oichel achilas kva. The chayr should apply in both cases. Unless we say that according to Yosef Shol, that's the gather of the chumrah. That the chumrah was only if the ma'isa has the full criteria of an achila, just happens to be arai because of what it is. Maybe they weren't mechayev chutz sukkah. Yesh la'ayin, if this nidin of Rabbeinu Yerucham is or isn't a raya to the din of Rabbi Yosef Shol. However, in Rabbi Seinu Achronim, we find a number of alternate mahalchim in Shittas Rambam. And as we'll see, there is a very broad nafkamina between the 2 basic explanations that Rabbi Seinu gave for the reason of the chumrah of not being sheisach chutz l'sukkah. The first mahalach on the supplementary Marim left-hand side is brought in Ramesh Shmuel Shapiro Sefer Kunshas HaBiurim, where he brings that Rebberal, son of the Briskirov, explained to him how the Briskirov learned this Rambam. So he says, "V'shomati mehagoyin rid Soloveitchik," that's Rebberal, Briskirov's son, "B'shem Oviv Rabbeinu HaRav, the pshita the gam b'peiros umayim ikir kiyum mitzvah sukkah." The Briskirov opened the basic shayla. When we say that someone should be machmir to be oichel teicha sukkah, so we asked, what's that chumrah? If it's not mechayev yeshiva sukkah, so what is one doing?
So far we had Rabbi Yosef Shalom Nachman that said it's HaRav. But we said the pashtus of Rabbi Yerucham, the Rishonim and they didn't understand that way. So the Brisker Rov is now going back to that basic question: what are we accomplishing by being machmer to HSukkah? What are we doing? So the Brisker Rov says it's poshut that there's a kiyum of mitzvah sukkah. One is considered to be mekayim mitzvah sukkah. Midekosav harambam the hareza meshubach nifla. According to Rabbi Yosef Shol, hareza meshubach. Hareza meshubach ordinarily is an expression which is used when a person is augmenting a mitzvah. He's adding to the kiyum, to the extent of the kiyum of the mitzvah. The kol hamarba l'safer b'tzias mitzrayim hareza meshubach. And we find examples like that, of being moisif on the kiyum of the mitzvah. So too the Rambam says, anyone who's moisif on matanos le'evyonim, hareza meshubach, more than the shir that chachamim were mechayev. Hareza meshubach we find in Hasei B'Leila Pesach, if he's moisif b'shas achila, is hareza meshubach. Meaning the ikr mechayev of the mitzvah goes so far, and one can, so to speak, extend the extent of the kiyum mitzvah al yedei. So Zot the Brisker Rov, hareza meshubach means we've somehow augmented the kiyum, the extent of the kiyum of the dira. According to Rabbi Yosef Shol, the lashon hareza meshubach doesn't seem to be accurate. Doesn't seem to be apt. Zot the Brisker Rov, the hadova borer came. Why? Sharei gam benichnas v'yoshev bo mevarich uknisa v'yeshiva eino ma'advar matzrichim sukkah elo dekol shenichnas v'yoshev bo ma'aseh diru u'mekayim mitzvah v'sukkos teishu came to duru mevarich v'achilas arai lo yivarach. So the Brisker Rov, if a person is nichnas into the sukkah and he hasn't begun eating yet, but the knisa is in order that he should be able to eat, or we could add, the Mishnah Berurah brings, and this is not the minhag olam like this, but it's kedai to know the Mishnah Berurah, that what happens if someone is being nichnas lasukkah and he is not going to eat a suda and he's eventually going to leave again. Very common scenario. Come home after mincha on Yontif, between Yontif Rishon and Yontif Sheni, right? Or even on the second day of Yontif, you come into the sukkah, it's already after Shkia, it's too late to eat anymore. But you're going to sit in the sukkah alone for another while until Ma'ariv. Do you make a YESHIVAS sukkah in that case? Ordinarily, we pass in that if you go into a sukkah, if eventually you'll be oichel, you'll make the bracha b'shas achila. Unless you're being nichnas in order to eat the suda right away, then you can make the bracha b'shas knisa. The Mishnah Berurah brings and passes like this, v'shem l'chayodom, that if you're not eventually going to eat an achila, so this yeshiva is not going to be tofel to the eventual achila, you're mechuyev to make a bracha b'YESHIVAS sukkah. Minhag olam is not like that, but that's what's mavur in the Mishnah Berurah b'shem l'chayodom. The minhag of Yidden always is when you go into the sukkah, they always say eat something machalesha. Why? When you go visit someone and you sit in their sukkah, the minhag of Klal Yisrael is to give something to eat, and it's a machalesha. Why? It's not just to give a schus mitzvah, or whatever it is, and the schus of the bracha. It's in order to avoid this suffix. Because let's say you go visit someone, right? And you're then gonna leave again b'kviyos to go to another sukkah, to go to daven, whatever it is. And you could spend an hour with a person in the sukkah. This is the shayla of the Mishnah Berurah. You're not going to eat the suda in the sukkah. You're eventually going to leave the sukkah again. Al yomachui v'leishav sukkah. The minhag of ordinary Yidden is machabracha machaleshev, because it avoids the suffix. How do you avoid the suffix if you're giving just some lekach and bromfin? It's not so clear. It avoids the suffix. It's a further limud. But this is a shayla. Zot the Brisker Rov al korchach we see that knisa, that yeshiva itself, just sitting, is considered a ma'aser of dira. I can sit outside the sukkah if I want, but when I do, it's considered the kiyum of mitzvah yeshiva. Memela zot the Brisker Rov achila sarai lo gora. Eating an achila sarai is no different to that even though achila sarai is not mechuyev to be done by sukkah, but when I come into the sukkah and perform an achila sarai in the sukkah, I am certainly fulfilling the mitzvah of dira. That's the Now, therefore, according to the Brisker Rov's Mahalach, we now come back to the question which Rabbi Yosef Shol was avoiding. So why isn't the hareza meshubach on knisa and yeshiva? Why don't we find the hareza meshubach? That Misha Machmer alatzmai not to be Yoshev Chutz LaSukkah is l'chapchila. Okay. How much don't find it? You don't find such a thing. This is the ha'ara possibly on the Briskirov. But we have our component from the Briskirov that Machmer HaRav Meshubach doesn't mean that in any way Shtir Toich HaSukkah is anything unique. Shtir Toich HaSukkah is just another example of sitting inside the sukkah. Where sitting inside the sukkah, even not for kva, is considered a ma'aseh dira, and therefore is considered the yeshiva Toich HaSukkah. It's not chayiv b'bracha. Chacham were only mesakin a bracha on achila, like we learned in the Tosas and the Rosh, but avad it's a ma'aseh dira. So according to the Briskirov, there's nothing unique in shtias mayim chutz HaSukkah and being machmer to be shaitan. It's simply an additional act of dira. That's what's mavur in the Rambam according to the Briskirov. However, there is a record that's printed in the Sefer Binyan Nachum. That's a Sefer Zikaron for Rav Nachum, where it has kisveyad of Talmidim, manuscripts of Shurim that Talmidim heard from Rav Nachum. And there Rav Nachum also came to explain this Rambam. Now, Rav Nachum makes a diuk nifla on the Rambam, which we haven't really touched on yet. What is this chumrah of not being shoyse yain chutzlas, of being shoyse mayim in the sukkah? Doesn't mean that wherever I have the opportunity, I'm going to drink mayim toich sukkah because it's an additional ma'aseh dira. Or does the chumrah actually say that I should never drink mayim outside the sukkah? What's the chumrah? The chumrah is, so to speak, to chaparain and take the mayim where I want to inside the sukkah. Or is the chumrah like is the pashtus of the Gemara? Rabbi Gamliel didn't want to drink the mayim out to the sukkah. He said, Halel sukkah. Mashma, he didn't want to even drink it chutz sukkah. Now, according to the Briskirov, that the chumrah is to just do an additional ma'aseh dira, there should be no reason why, if you don't want to, that you shouldn't drink mayim chutz sukkah. The chumrah is someone who's machmer to make an additional ma'aseh dira that he's not mechuyev to do. But so I forgo the opportunity. Okay, I forgo the opportunity. There's no reason not to be shayes chutz sukkah. Zokt Reb Nachum, a diuk nifla on the Rambam, the lotion of hamachmir al atzmoi shelo yishteh chutz sukkah doesn't seem to support the Briskirov. According to the Briskirov, what's motivating? What's the gain of being shayes mayim basukkah? I did an additional ma'aseh dira. I sat in the sukkah a little longer, like the Sisei the Sheresh Habodah said, no ma'aseh dira. Hamachmir? The lotion of the Rambam is Hamachmir shev'lo yishteh chutz sukkah afilu mayim. Mashma, the chumra is to ever be shoyse mayim chutz sukkah. What's that? What's the machmir shelo yishteh mayim chutz sukkah? That's bothering Reb Nachum. He says v'yesh. I'm sorry. Two very different things. Yes, we will madgish this. The Briskirov is saying that the HaRav Meshubach is an additional kiyum of mitzvah sukkah, like you've had the YESHIVAS sukkah. Every moment spent in the sukkah is dira. So if I'm shoyse mayim toich sukkah, there's dira. The mitzvah of sukkah itself, and Reb Shlomo will emphasize that as we conclude the Reb Nachum, and we'll see very clearly how Reb Nachum is being mechadish something very different from the Briskirov. Zot Reb Nachum. V'yesh l'daktik b'dvarav shegeder hachumra hu sheloi lishtois mayim chutz lasukkah v'loi rak shekizhu mezumenes lefonav sukkah yakpid lishtois mayim basukkah. That if you have a sukkah, you'll chaparain. Elo yakpid sheloi lishtois chutz lasukkah. That diuk in the Rambam is not explained by the Briskirov. Correct, and therefore, if you'd be machmir, if you didn't have a sukkah, you wouldn't drink. Excellent, and that's the ikar chiddush that Reb Nachum tuzuf. And therefore, now we come to the first nafkamina. According to the Briskirov, what's the chumrah? The chumrah is chaparai nocha yeshiva sukkah. Like this, like you say, the Sheresh Habodah has said. Another, we'll supplement and augment and expand the extent of the dira. Bleiben in sukkah nocha minut. According to Reb Nachum, nicht doch steht in Rambam. Steht in Rambam, if I don't have a sukkah and I want to follow the chumrah, I won't drink mayim. Zot the Reb Nachum a mechudesh together, and he says like this. Ubedvorim elu habir. When Rambam says HaRav Meshubach, what the explanation is, shechachomim nosnu kitzvah la mitzvah shu chayav. The Chacham explained to us the kitzvah of the mitzvah, what the parameters of the mitzvah are. Aval kol shemoisif bo yesh bezeh kiyu mitzvah. Elo shemamshech es hamitzvah yoser mikashir hamechuyev. You have a way to create a kiyum mitzvah which are not mechuyev in at all. Which means if a person wants to be machmir, he can be machmir on himself to the extent that he then becomes mechuyev to be sheisemayim basukkah. He has established that his yeshiva sukkah should go so far that even Arai is also chutz sukkah. That's what he's saying. A person can, in some instances, time doesn't allow us to explain when and when not we find this din, but a person sometimes can expand the mitzvah. Lefiza mizboyer she'af b'shtiyas mayim basukkah yesh kiyum mitzvah v'zeu shekosavam shemachmer shelo lishtas hareza meshubach the mashma shemamshech alat mekiyum mitzvah yoser me'achiu shechivasei Torah. And therefore the hakpada will be not to be sheisamayim chutz sukkah. So you have a broad nafkamina. According to Reb Nachum, the chumrah is never to even to be sheisamayim chutz sukkah, even if there isn't a sukkah lefanov, because I have the ability to be mamshech on myself the chiyuv such that I've expanded the chiyuv to include shtiyas mayim, and therefore I won't do it chutz sukkah. Mashenkin lefi the brisker of, it's only if there's a sukkah mezumenas lefanov be ma'aseh v'kiyum by going in the sukkah. Correct, entirely different meshubach. Correct. The fear of brisker of meshubach means I gained another a yeshiva sukkah. The fear of Nochum, HaRav Meshubach means the shvach is that I've expanded the parameters of the mitzvah, and sometimes we can do that.
Person is Meshubach.
Okay. Well, there's a shalat Meshubach means the mice is Meshubach, the person is Meshubach, but yes. Yeah.
Somebody wasn't like, he has no chiyuv because there's no sukkah there. The Torah was mechaber when you have a sukkah. You have a plane, not shaykh have a sukkah. Then you
That's a much broader shayla. That would allow you even to eat pass. That's a much broader shayla. Here we're speaking about in a case, would you be machmering yourself in an oifen that let's say you would be so if you will reach a sukkah, not to be sheisamayim chutz sukkah. Now, just to end with the zisa nafkamin al halacha. And this is very relevant and almost takes the entire application of this halacha from halacha l'maisa. Why? Zod b'shloim zalman. If a person the reason why to be sheisamayim chutz sukkah is only a chumrah is because the shtiyas mayim is arai. And we saw the Lashon Mishnah Berurah is that a person will drink arai chutz lebeisa. Sometimes. A person will be sheis arai chutz lebeisa. Zod b'shloim zalman, but if you're standing right next to your bayis, you would go into your bayis to drink. So memele, if you step out of your sukkah for a moment, you cannot drink chutz la sukkah. It's only if you're a distance from the bayis. And then the shaila is, would a person be sheisa chutz sukkah? You could be sheisa chutz sukkah. But to be sheisa somuch labayis, Shlomo Zalman says you can't do. It's very interesting, just to finish.
It's told in these two havonas.
And maybe told in these two havonas, and perhaps we'll discuss it further. I heard from an old Alter Yerushalayim Yid, his name was Reb Zelig Weinberg. He was a boy base of the Brisker Rov. That one time on Sukkah, he came to the Brisker Rov and he saw the Brisker Rov was drinking a tea outside the Sukkah. He said, Rebbe, you start eingehen in Sukkah? So the Brisker Rov said, steht in Rambam, ma machmir, ma zene nish machmir, it's no makayim neshuras adin. So the Brisker Rov said, the Zelig Weinberg said, as in der Wort von Brisker Rov liegt die ganze Teure vom Brisk. Zene nish machmir, and Ovo steht. And Rambam steht mefuris, ma machmir. The Brisker Rov was standing right next to the Sukkah, and he drank chutz sukkah. This girl wasn't chayshish for this sorrow of Shlomo Zalman. But Lemaisa, it's a svara alimta, and it's a svara to be done in.
But according to Zalman, also would only be if you were already in the sukkah first, maybe.
According to Rias Rishol.
Yeah. No, I'm saying, would you put this together with Shlomo Zalman?
Together with Shlomo Zalman, no, it's any time. It says in that case,
anytime.
Anytime
within Daled Amos of sukkah.
Person wouldn't be sheisach chutz habeisa in that case. You don't have the ikr heter of Adam sheisach chutz habeisa. Just to finish with some Divrei Haggadah relevant to the Yom of Rosh Hashanah, Ba'aleinu L'Tova. Our schus to be Osik B'Torah together through the Chodesh HaRachmim Baratzon is that we understand that one of the most potent forms we have of Hachana for the Yimei Hadin is Al Yedei Osik HaTorah. In the Sefer Malas HaTorah of Avram Achi Hagra, in the beginning of the Sefer, he brings a medrash. The medrash is on the pasuk that we say in Zechronos, Habein Yakili Ephraim and Yeled Shashur. Ki midei dabri boy zochar es kirenu oid. Al kein homu me'aloi. Rachem rachemenu nu Hashem. One of the most. It's a chastening psukim in Zechroinas. He says, Isa b'medrash, midei dabri boy zeh Torah. Al kein zochar es kirenu oid v'hazechiro hi bracha. It means that through Torah the Rebbeinu Shalom was zeicher v'bracha. K'may shenem Hashem zchor yoyin v'varach. Shal de'aschiro shezoicher Hashem oisanu onu zoichim l'chol ha'brachas. So zok the Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac Chover in his Hagois Or Torah. He says, how is Midei Dabri Boy talking about Torah? Maybe Midei Dabri Boy is talking about Tefillah. Chuim Ochim Dvarim is talking about Tefillah or Vidui. How is it Midei Dabri Boy? Because the beginning of the pasuk is Habein Yakil Ephraim im Yeled Sha'ashum. What makes Klal Yisrael the Yeled Sha'ashum of the Rebbeinu Shalom? Zod Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac Chover, the Rebbeinu Shalom has a Sha'ashua. What's the Sha'ashua of the Rebbeinu Shalom? It's Torah Kedusha. Sha'ashua of the Rebbeinu Shalom. It's Chazak. Habein Yakir Ephraim. What makes Klal Yisrael the Ben Yakir? What brings us to Dveikus in B'rei Olam? That we're the Ben Yakir. Im Yeled Sha'ashuim, because we're the Yeled that is Oisik in the Sha'ashua of the Rebbeinu Shalom. Memele Kimidei Dabri Boy, when the Rebbeinu Shalom himself, Al Yidei Klal Yisrael being Oisik B'Torah, is similarly Kiviyachol Moitzi Divrei Torah Mipiv, like the Gemara says in Gittin, Ba'Oisei Shal Ma'av Yosser B'ni Oimer Kach, that the Rebbeinu Shalom is being Medabri B'Torah. Memele Midei Dabri Boy Zochar Es Kirenu Oid. That's Ma'oira the Zikaron. Just to quote, just very briefly, a Lashon Nifla of the Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac Chover in Or Torah Ois Yud. He says, Iker haschira lifnei Hashem u'b'schus ha'Torah. Zechroinos, the Gemara says, Bameh is b'shofar. Zot Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac Chover lizkor schus ha'Torah shenitno b'tkiyas shofar. He says, V'lochein b'rosh Hashanah sheyom hazikaron lifkod al kol ha'maisim v'lifkod kol yitzurei kedem. Tzivu yizbarach litkoya b'shofar lizkor schus ha'Torah shehi ha'oimedes lonu b'yoyim adin. Zok there ki ochois lonu bebeis hamelach. Ki ochois lonu bebeis hamelach. The lashon that's borrowed from the Klal Yisrael, the Medrash by Esther. Ki ochois lonu bebeis hamelach. What allows us to even be beiteach that however rochuk we are from the Rebbeinu Shalom, we have a way once again to be the Ben Yakir. Zok the B'tzak Isaac Chov, because we have an ochois bebeis hamelach. We have an association that we're close to and is the Ochais Kiviyachol in the Beis HaMelech. Why? Because Torah is the Soid Malbush Elyon. Kiviyachol, Torah is the Levushim of Kutche Brichu. And we, Klal Yisrael, have a shaykhis to that. That's the Ochais Lon of Beis HaMelech. If we can in some way have a shaykhis to Esek HaTorah, then in some way we have a way to be the Ben Yakil Ephraim. So in Mela, Zok the B'tzak as it covered, that's what we've been nischanen for. Habein Yakil Ephraim and Yeled Shashuim. He says, Kimei Dabri Boy Zochar Es Kirenu Oid, it's Goyim as Yikar on the table. Al Kein Homu Me'ai Lo is Midas Rachmim, Rachim Rachmenu. The Iker Koyach we have to be Ma'oir Rachma Bizbarach is because Eilonu Shiur Rak HaTorah Hazais. The Ochis Lonu Bebeis HaMelech to be Dovuk Boy Yizbarach is only Ayidei Esek HaTorah. That's all we have. That's the Ochis Lonu Bebeis HaMelech. The Mokum that we don't want to have Karbanos Eilonu Shiur Rak HaTorah Hazais. And the whole Tkiyah Shoifar Zot Lo'ir HaTorah is Be'ikr. To be ma'oyer, the Torah shenitno b'shofar b'hasina, because that's the ochis lanu beis hamelech, and in that schus will be nizkar be'ez Hashem to ksiva v'chastima tova b'sech sifrim shetzim. It's over 4 pages. This is the baby application. It's here. Oh, that's not. No, I'm saying on your book. No copyright.
See, we typed that, but 1 second, wait, I'm just taking a picture, give me 1 second, and I'll,
Seems like